Hi, friends. I am Marion Woods, founder of Life Above Foundation, your host, a professional counselor, family and marriage therapist, and a wholeness life coach. Welcome to Relationship Real Talk, the podcast where we dive deep and tackle the toughest relationship challenges Christians face today. Are you tired of struggling with unforgiveness, past wounds, and conflicts? Feeling lonely or having trouble communicating? Wrestling with trust issues or trying to balance your faith with your relationship goals? Feeling stuck and stagnant in your relationship? You are in the right place. Here at the Relationship Real Talk, we get real and cover a wide range of topics, including relationship anxiety, trauma bonds, infidelity, estrangement, toxic dynamics, dating after divorce, and how to heal from relationship trauma and grow and build healthy and lasting relationships. We're not just about identifying the problems. We're all about finding real, integrated solutions from multiple disciplines and offering professional help from different fields to mend and strengthen your relationships. So, let's get started on this journey together, one honest, heartfelt conversation at a time. Welcome to this episode. I'm your host, Marion Woods. So today again with us is Marion Knell. She has talked about understanding trauma, PTSD, and the relationship, the roadmap through crisis in our first episode. So Marion Knell, she now consults with the European Freedom Network and the Refugee Highway Partnership on care for refugees, refugee workers, and the mental health of refugee children. Marion has developed and recorded a course for workers and churches on working with traumatized refugees and sustaining refugee workers, which has received the CPT certification. She teaches regularly with Christian Medical Fellowship and is currently delivering a course into Ukraine on receiving soldiers back from war. Welcome, Marion, once again.
Thank you, Marie. It's good to be back to you again.
So today is our second episode. Marion, she brings us this topic called recovery, restoration, and the relationships. And again, she will present the roadmap to us, how to grow after the trauma.
Right, good. Thank you, Marie. So for those of us who were with us last week, you'll remember that we actually looked at the roadmap. We did a brief look at post-traumatic growth, and this week, we're going to look at, so how do we help somebody both at the bottom of the cliff and continue that journey up? Because there are no finished phases in this. This is an ongoing journey. We're with people, and we need, if they're going to trust us, they need to know that we're in it for the long haul to help them. Just a quick reminder of PTSD and the signs of it. You will have seen it in people. There's intrusion, where people keep having spontaneous memories of the traumatic event through their current dreams or flashbacks. And one of the things, of course, is that we're trying to reorientate them to ground them, as it's been said, in a new place, because there will always be triggers. But if we can manage to get people grounded to realize that that event is gone and they are grounded. And another thing that is a sign is avoidance, where people don't try not to talk about it or express their feelings. So distressing memories, thoughts, feelings, or reminders of the event are avoided. So sometimes people just don't even go out of their houses lest they encounter it again. Alterations in cognition and mood, how they think and how their general mood is. And then the arousal and effect reactive symptoms, where people can become very irritable, have angry outbursts, behave recklessly on a self-destructive way, or are over-watchful of their surroundings in a suspecting way. Something else might happen. And when you hear those last four symptoms, you will realize how profoundly they can affect relationships. Marriage. I use a case study with the Ukrainians, and there's a husband who is either surly or quiet, or he just bursts out in anger when something doesn't happen, and bursts out in anger with his child. The child does something that he would normally ignore, but suddenly it blows up into something, and daddy isn't daddy anymore. So social distancing may result from dealing with the pain of trauma, and unresolved trauma can lead to anger, blame, or resentment, which causes friction and heightened conflict in a marriage. So what we're talking about is, how do we help people process that, and how do we help people grow? Because what the research shows, that only a minority of people exposed to traumatic events develop long-standing psychiatric disorders. And in fact, the literature of reports of growth experiences in the aftermath of traumatic events tend to outnumber the reports of psychiatric disorders, which is really encouraging, but only if it's handled well, if people have that ability to, what Tedeschi describes as ruminating. And he has this word, ruminating is the cognitive process, actively thinking through whilst not reliving the experience and processing it positively, is transformational. That space to reflect or ruminate is invaluable. He says this again, which takes us back to our relationships. Social support may promote deliberate rumination, reflection, and the active rebuilding of assumptions. You remember we talked about shattered assumptions. The active rebuilding of assumptions following a traumatic experience. The cognitive processing of trauma into growth seems to be aided in many people by self-disclosure in supportive social environments. In other words, when they feel they're in a safe place where people aren't going to judge them or criticize them, that I think is really important to see that at the heart of what we're doing. So there are, if we look at 5 areas of post-traumatic growth, all right, these are the 5 things that will be the products if we do this job at the bottom and up the hill well, all right? This is what's been found. Firstly, a greater appreciation for life in general. Actually, when you've had some things taken away, there can come a point where you are more appreciative of the life you have. Secondly, and listen to this, warmer, more intimate relationships, an increased sense of connection to those who suffer. You now have a built-in empathy, but warmer, more intimate relationships. Thirdly, an increased sense of personal strength. If I live through that, I can face anything. Fourthly, a recognition of new possibilities in life and a changed sense of priorities. And fifthly, a deepening of spiritual life belief system. That's quite a surprising list,
right,
to come.
Yes.
Especially if you come from a position of disillusionment. I think that's really very encouraging. And the same study said, and I think we said this last week, what predisposes people to PTG? A socially supportive environment, non-judgmental acceptance, healthy relationships, and the ability to reflect. There we are, we're back with that ruminating, that reflection that does not relive the experience. So one of the important things we have to help people to do is to sit and listen, not necessarily ask questions, sit and listen. Don't give advice. Don't minimize what you're listening to, but listen without any of that. And so people who have listening skills are really important in this. And after that, people find new and hidden strengths, relationships to strengths and priorities and values are altered. So let's go back to that definition of post-traumatic growth so that we can see what it is. Post-traumatic growth describes the experience.
Hang on a second.
Yes.
So you were talking about the supportive, social supportive relationships. As you were talking about, and I'm just realizing that as caregivers, no matter it's professional or just normal people, that we have to learn how to care for people they have wounded or traumatized by intentionally listen to the person without any judgment, without presumption, without the tendency to fix this person, without providing suggestions, advice in that case, but just sympathize and listen, provide the presence. Correct?
Correct. Yes, absolutely. So I could have summarized it better than myself. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's quite hard because we tend to want to try and fix. And so this facilitation is I think well, I've got a separate section on that, is giving the reflection, giving that place to reflect. And that takes time. Not all going to happen in one session.
Right.
And part of that, I think, as you listen and time goes on, is education, because one of the things that we're trying to do with people, because they think they've gone crazy, they think the world's gone crazy, is to normalize the symptoms. And sometimes this is where having a knowledge of critical incident debriefing is helpful. People can do training in critical incident debriefing. It's obviously it's best done within 48 to 72 hours of an incident, but you can use the tools of debriefing. And with debriefing, you let the person tell their story. You let them say how they feel about it, how it affected them, what are their memories of it, what stays with them now, and how would they reflect on that, and how do they think it will affect the future. So you've got if you've got a structure of critical incident debriefing, you have a framework in which to do your listening, which is quite helpful. But helping, so affirming people in their reactions, saying what you're feeling is quite normal. Maybe reflecting on stress. What is stress? How do you know when you're stressed? High levels of stress in this situation. Provide support to make the distress manageable. Maybe relaxation exercises. My friend who works with children in Kiev, traumatized children, just recently, a week or so ago, they had an enormous bombing raid and they were all affected. And she was working with her team on breathing exercises, calming exercises, and then helping them to think about ways in which they can rest and relax and what's possible in the situation that they're in, of course. Listening without trying to solve it, with empathy. Bear with people in silence. Don't try and make them talk. I think that's another important. And safeguard them. I think providing feedback when the person has unrealistic thoughts or tries to engage in risky behavior, because often that's something that happens at the bottom there. It can be risky behavior, it can be alcoholism, drugs, all sorts of things, or making unwise decisions. That isn't a time to make decisions, or doesn't take care of themselves. So safeguard them, avoid minimizing it, spiritualizing it. We're trying to get recovery, remember. We're trying to help them work through recovery. And I think as we talk about that, there are two things. Well, one thing in particular we can help them do. We talked last week about the fact that one of the things down the slope was loss, and helping people to grieve healthily is really important. So if people are not familiar with the grief curve, that's something that we certainly teach our Ukrainians. It's the normal kind of movement of stages that people go through in grief. It's not as simple as a curve, I don't think, because I think people oscillate between the different things. But, you know, the stages, the initial stages.
For a second, Marianne. So the grief, the grief is necessary and it's important when people are getting healing from PTSD, from trauma, as a part of the process. Grief, right?
Absolutely, dealing with grief. Don't squash it down. It's really important, and recognizing that grieving takes time. A lot of people who are bereaved say, you know, within a month or two, somebody's saying, oh, you need to pick yourself up. Well, no, you may need at least a year, because you go through each season without that person. So understanding that what is facing you is the person who's in that first stage of grief, where there's that shock, numbness, denial, this can't be true. And then the second stage, where it's anger, disorganization, panic. They may be angry at God, they may be angry at somebody else. And then at the bottom of the curve, the stage 3 is when people feel very isolated, lonely, depressed. But eventually, again, if they better and better, if they've got somebody to process it with, you begin to come up where they begin to be able to envisage a different life. You know, life is not going to be the same. You can't repair that life. Life will be different. And maybe they've developed new strengths from having to do things by themselves, but also are ready to start having new relationships. And I don't mean romantic relationships. I mean new, healthy social relationships. And that's, again, where we as a church family can come alongside and not leave that person isolated. And then as they come up that curve of the grief, there begins to be hope, affirmation, and they begin to look outside of themselves to others. Because when you're in the middle of grief, you're very, very self-centered. It's all about me and what's happening to me. And you know you're beginning to get out of it when you look to others and realize that you can be a helper. And so I think helping people to process that. And another tool, because I wanted to talk about tools this week as well, is we use biblical lament as a tool. I mean, the Psalms are full of lament. And it's a very powerful tool. And one person says, lament is different from crying, because lament is a form of prayer. Lament talks to God about pain. It's a God-given invitation to pour out our fears, frustrations, and sorrows to help us renew our confidence in God. So we talk through about the 5 stages of a lament, talking to God about your complaint, list your struggles, your pain, your problems, your unanswered prayer. Thirdly, confess your faith and hope in God, ask boldly for help, and choose to trust. And then we get people, we do an example, we read Psalm 42, for instance, and get people to write their own lament. And there's something immensely healthy about that. And I don't think I've met anyone who hasn't really found that immensely helpful as a tool. And again, just as we're going up the side of that hill in restoration, that will be at the same time as going up the curve of grief.
That's a good point. So restoration from the map in our first episode is a person goes back to the normal life. How does a normal life feels like for the person again, right? That called a restoration. Maybe even better.
Well, I was going to say the whole point of for post-traumatic growth, and I don't think we spelt this out last time, but at the top of that curve, there are 3 possible positions. So there's the first one is the victim, where the person is permanently damaged by the event. Now, this often happens to people who haven't had the support in processing it that we're talking about. Or some people choose to be victims. They choose to define themselves by that. Then there's the survivor. And that's the person who goes back to the level of functioning where they were before. So they're back to what they would call, inverted commas, normal functioning. But the possibility of PTG is the celebrant. That's the third thing, where actually you are at a level of greater resilience and functioning than you were before the event.
I see. So summarize up, you are saying the restoration process is ongoing process. So the bottom level is the person stuck in the victim mentality, stay in the victimized mentality. I'm damaged goods, I'm no good anymore, it's broken, unrepairable, hopeless, that kind of situation. Then the second level is the survival mode. Assuming back to normal again, but still cope with unhealthy sabotaging mechanism, stuck in a survival mode. And the third level you were talking about is that the celebrant, celebrant, and that's the level the person gain resilience and become stronger and healthier.
Yeah. I mean, here's what one bereaved parent said. When my husband died, people just came out of the woodwork. I realized that relationships with people are really important now. And I cherish my husband. Oh, no, it was a son that died, sorry. And I cherish my husband a lot more. The experience of deeper and more meaningful relationships can occur along with the loss or disappearance of other relationships. And learning how to lament is an invaluable tool. So I think that's important. One other issue which people very often have to deal with in that bottom piece and on the way up is the whole issue of shame and guilt. We have a new moral injury is a new, well, it's been around for a little while, but it came to the fore, I think, during, it's always been there in war contexts, although not necessarily recognized. And it got some prominence during the time of COVID, because moral injury is when you have to do something that transgresses your moral code and you don't have a choice. So it's always been there with military because you're out, you believe you shouldn't kill people, but if you're in a war, that's part of the job. Or it came with people who were first responders. There's been an earthquake and you choose who do you dig out and who do you not dig out. And then COVID came and there were doctors who'd sworn their Hippocratic oath, having to decide who went on a ventilator and who didn't. In other words, they were making life and death choices. So guilt is feeling that we've done something or not done something or thought it or have survived when someone else suffered. So survivor guilt, you'll often find that in this. And shame is the feeling that we are bad or deeply flawed, the desire to hide and not admit our pain. So how do we help people who are dealing with guilt and shame at the bottom of that crisis? Because maybe, particularly if it's survivor guilt, I should have been able to save X or Y. I had one family in Ukraine, fat bombed, mum and baby died in one room, father and son survived in the next room. How do you deal with that? Why? Think of that man and how he deals with it. So there's helping people to help themselves, being patient with themselves, deciding when they want to talk. And the big thing here is self-forgiveness. These people have to forgive themselves because nobody else is judging them for it. God doesn't judge them for it. So how do you deal with self-forgiveness? How do you see that your own mental health and emotional needs are met? And sitting with those emotions, helping them to, Isabel, we're back almost to ruminating. Explore the feelings rather than avoid them. Figure out what there is. And I've got some questions that people can ask themselves. We won't go into that. But what we know helps is if people can tell their story to someone they trust. Here we are, back to the trust relationship. Somebody who's suffering from moral injury, guilt, and shame. And the listener, again, needs to not minimize the person's feelings or rush to talk about forgiveness. That's the end of the journey. But over time, there will be forgiving themselves and accepting the forgiveness of God. And again, things that helped were shown to be re-establishing relationships with family and community, spending time helping others and doing useful things for individuals or the community, finding a new focus, participating in a community or church. And all of those are very interesting facets that feed in, I think, to what we've been talking about in terms of our relationships, the role of that in getting that restoration happening, because moral injury, shame and guilt is another restorative process that has to happen.
Wow, you just talk about so key, so important, those components for recovery and the restoration. And all those steps happen in the context of healthy relationships, no matter it's a professional relationship or caring relationships, or even just a friendship, or just
that's what people need. Friends, good friend. That's what a good friend does, isn't it? They sit with you and they listen with you. And of course, if you look at Middle Eastern contexts, there's a lot more about the presence of people. You know, when people lose someone, everybody comes, and they come with food, so the person, but they just sit. They sit and are with. There is the presence. They presence themselves in the sense that God presents himself with us. You know, in a sense, as God's children, we are his presence. We are the ones that can presence ourselves and give that gift. Just one more factor, I think, that we've sort of touched on. That's the idea of resilience.
right.
So resilience is the ability to spring back. So resiliere is the Latin for to spring back, and it's used in engineering in terms of a metal that is put under stress, and its resilience is tested by how much it can regain its stress, its shape, its original shape. So that's been sort of transferred into human experience. How much stress can we tolerate, and how can we resume shape? And there were 3 findings about resilience and PTG. One was that resilience plays an important role in the development of PTG. Now, that's partly how resilient people were beforehand. People who lacked resilience beforehand are more prone to greater damage than those who were resilient. Along with growth, the fruit of post-traumatic growth may include a preparedness or resilience for future events. There's that personal strength. And the third finding was that highly resilient people experience less post-traumatic growth than less resilient people. So again, when we're looking at the pre-crisis thing, we're looking, well, what was their level of resilience in the 4 realms of personal, spiritual, emotional, and physical resilience? They're the 4 kind of domains that we're looking at. There's a very good resilience questionnaire that came out with Resilience in Faith and Life, I think the book was called. But how can we promote resilience? What helps? How can we enable people? Because one of the things about climbing that hill back up to restoration and celebrant is empowering and enabling people. The danger is when you're in that bottom bit that you do fall to, rather than getting to the point where you enable them to. You're walking alongside, but increasingly you want to increase their capacity and enable them to thrive in a social community. So I think that's.
I really like that metaphor as a person down to the deeper valley what we can do, just sit silently most of the time, hopefully with our presence, with the person, step into their shoes to sympathize with them, without, again, in our first episode, without judgment, without the minimizing or spiritual problems, and just, in the deeper valley, the person all they need is a presence. Then
right.
after that phase, and we have to, you mentioned about empowering, enabling people to step on the journey of recovery and to come up from the deeper valley, right? With
Yeah.
all the tools you just provided.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you wanted to I've got one more thing at the end I want to say, but we've got kind of, if you like, summarizing reaction and recovery. So we've got a reaction to the loss of relationships, parents, family, community, grief, depression. And our recovery goal is to restore attachment and connection to others who can offer emotional support and care and overcome grief and loss. And then the reaction to the shattering assumptions about humanity, trust, dignity, and meaning destroyed. Our recovery goal is to restore meaning and purpose to life. And then the reaction to guilt and shame. Our recovery goal is to restore dignity and value, including reducing excessive shame and guilt. That's a little kind of mini cameo package of what we do. I love the story of Joseph in the Bible. If you want a biblical thing, I mean, he was buried alive, sold into slavery, accused and convicted of rape, spent years in prison, and yet he says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Now that's post-traumatic growth.
Right. That's a perfect, typical example from the Bible.
Yeah, yeah. And I also, just one last thing. Do you know the Japanese of our art of kintsugi? Have you come
Yes.
across that? Yes.
Mhm.
Well, I just love that because for those of our listeners who don't know it, it's a way of mending broken pottery, but you don't do it so you disguise the cracks. You mend it with gold so that you can the object, the pot, becomes a whole pot again, but you can see where it was damaged, but it's mended with gold.
Right.
And that philosophy, that is what God does with us.
Mm-hmm.
He restores us, and he does it with beauty. But the scars are there, but they are beautiful scars. And I think that whole I think it's Isaiah 61, the what we call the exchange at the cross, beauty for brokenness, the oil of joy for ashes, that
For
that,
beauties.
beautifying what was not beautiful, is again a lovely picture. And this whole topic just gives me great hope for the people that I work with, and gives them great hope too.
Right. Hope. We all need the hope. What a hope that you provided us, Marianne, today. So thankful for you. And what an ending with that beautiful picture in our minds that, the PTSD or trauma or how you're affected by trauma is not the end of the world. And there's great tools, solutions, and God's people out there, people are loving, caring, and get into those groups and have those healthy social connections and learn those tools. As you were talking about, grief process is definitely necessary and help us to start to heal, to recover. And also you're talking about the moral injury, how to deal with the guilt and the shame. And we need a self-forgiveness as well, and that's so important piece. And also, you mentioned about a lament, how to do reflection. And those are the tools we have to implement and do this work in the concept of healthy relationship once again. So Marianne, as we are closing our episode today, do you have a last word or encouraging words for our churches, our caregivers, or professionals?
Dear me, I hadn't prepared for this. I thought I'd give my father. I think, well, I think from the point of our churches and things, the image of the body working together, how important that is, and that no part is inferior. Some people think that, oh, it's only these professional people, these psychiatrists and psychologists, but actually that's not true. And ultimately, of course, we haven't talked about him, but our model is Jesus in this, in how he gave himself to people, but also he had good boundaries, which we haven't talked about, the helpers, but good self-care, good boundaries. Jesus went off in solitude. He made sure he had time with his Father, no matter how many crowds were pressing upon him. And to have that wisdom in terms of how we minister and to whom we minister is really important, I think. And then it's God's work in the end. This is not my mission. It's not my mission to save the world, bring people. That's his job. But he chooses to use us as instruments. He chooses to use us as co-workers, and that's a great privilege. But we do it under his direction.
Absolutely. That's a really good example for the good ending. And as Christians, and we have to follow our shepherd as he is a caregiver, a great caregiver for all of us. So learn from Jesus how he cared for people, and that's the good way to go. So thank you for listening to today's episode. Thanks once again, Marianne, for your wonderful work and for your expertise. Your knowledge is absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marie. Thank you.